Just so everybody knows, you can go to the church's YouTube page and find all these Sunday mornings recorded. Anyway, so he gets arrested, and a couple of weeks ago we saw he got brought to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time. Then Caiaphas comes up and he's going to conduct his questioning of Jesus, and that's a real questioning. They've decided he's committed blasphemy. We saw that Caiaphas stood up, ripped his robe, says, "What else do we need to hear? This man has blasphemed, and he's worthy of death, etc., etc." But they can't do anything about it. So they have to take him to the civil leaders. The civil government's the only ones. If you want to put him to death, if they wanted to beat him up, if they wanted to throw him in jail, put him on a galley ship, and the Jews didn't have galley ships, the Romans did. But whatever, they could have done that. But it was important to them that they kill him. So they had to go to the governor, who's Pontius Pilate. And that's kind of where we left off last week in those first two verses of chapter 7. It says, they took him to the praetorium, to Pontius Pilate. And then we got off onto last week what we discussed were Peter's denials come right after those first, he gets taken there, and then Matthew inserts it all about Peter's denials. And then it goes over to, that, they took him to Pontius Pilate. And then he goes into the story about Judas, and Judas, killing himself, throwing the money back in the blood money back into the temple and killing himself. And that brings us to where we are today in Matthew 27, verses 11 through 14. Well, we're going to go through the end of the chapter. But it says in verse 11, "Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus said, 'You have said so.'" Now here's the thing. Who's this Pontius Pilate guy?
He's the governor.
Yeah, he's the governor. It said that. No, but you know what? I mean, when we read through the stories, and we're going to go through both stories. What I want to do is, like the first half of the class, we go through this story in Matthew 27, and then the second half, let's go through the story in John 18. The same event told a little bit differently, but I think they add details to show us what's happening. But we said today, "I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried." How did Pontius Pilate get in all of this? Pontius Pilate's a guy, he's in a couple of chapters, and he's the only one who's not everybody else mentioned in the Jesus story: God the Father, the Holy Spirit, Mary, Jesus, all the normal Bible characters. And then you got Pontius Pilate mentioned. There's a lot of people who had big impacts in the Bible, that don't get mentioned in the creed. But there he is, and there must be something special, about him, because Jesus took abuse from other people besides Pontius Pilate. So as we go through this, we'll see. So anyway, he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now remember, all that we've read is that they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" We must miss something in there that, Matthew doesn't tell us. Like, did they bring I don't know, an indictment, written indictment, that would say, because we're going to find out that I don't think, and I've said this before, I don't think Pontius Pilate knew who Jesus was. I don't think that he had a clue who Jesus was until he shows up on the doorstep. Okay, because we don't see anything where they've had any interaction. And when we see the questioning by Pontius Pilate, it's going to be like, who are you and why are you here? Or to the Jewish leaders, who is this and why'd you bring him to me? But somehow he's got this insight to say, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, you've said so. That's like saying, you said it, buddy, and make no mistake about it. But we don't quite read it that way, but in that first century, that's the way people spoke. So so people, continue to make the claim that, Jesus never claimed to be God, but this is a first century Middle Eastern way of doing it. And in verse 12, he says, but when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. So that goes back to the prior trial he had. They kept asking him who he was, and he just really said, nothing. Jesus doesn't try to justify himself before the group. He's a lamb to be led to slaughter. And what's he going to do if he's a lamb led to slaughter? And that's what Isaiah prophesied. What does it say if he argues with him? If he goes, no, I'm not. Do you have proof? I mean, he can't do it, but they don't understand that. That just infuriates them. So, and then it comes into, how is Jesus going to reign? If he's a king, how's he going to reign over his everlasting, kingdom? So then Pilate said to him in verse 13, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? So, Pilate's trying to cajole him to defend himself. Like, I can't help you, buddy, if you don't. You gotta remember, Pilate probably doesn't like the Jewish leaders any more than they like him or they like Jesus. It's kind of like a mutual tension society that everybody has there, and I'm sure it's because nobody trusts anybody, and everybody's trying to hang on to their power, right?
Pontius Pilate send Jesus to Herod Antipas?
Well, we'll get into that. So yeah, because what Ray asked if he didn't hear him, he goes, didn't Pilate send him to Herod Antipasta? No, Antipas. And yeah, because he's going, why is he here before me? He's going to say, this is a religious issue. You guys take care of it. But it's in those answers that we get to, or not Judas, Pontius Pilate's reactions and what he did, that we're going to find out why he ended up in the creed. So he says in verse 14, but he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Jesus is doing all of this that he's getting arrested for, beaten for, he'll end up by being crucified for, is for us. I think he's also sending a message to his disciples. You may stand in front of kings and governors, but they've got nothing on you, so you don't feel like you have. And that's probably where Peter failed last week in his denials of Christ, is he figured he had to justify something to protect himself. Instead, I mean, how easy, I mean, I don't know how easy it would have been because I don't know what I would have done. But I mean, it would have been simple, it seems like, for Peter to stand up and say, yeah, I'm a follower of hers. What are you going to do about it? and then they beat him or something, you know? So, so Jesus takes our place, remains silent, and he'll not escape the wrath of God. And that's what Isaiah 53:7 says. It says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. And like a lamb that was led to slaughter, and like a sheep that before the shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And so again, this is that Jesus thing of walking through his whole life, fulfilling prophecies. And I don't think he said, "Well, this is my moment. I'll quote Isaiah because I've got to answer that part." I think it's just who he is and how he does things. He goes through, he's fulfilling all the things that Israel failed to do, and he's fulfilling the prophecies that were made so that after the resurrection, when like Joe was saying, all the puzzle pieces are coming together, now you can see what that intent was. Like that. And it's like, oh, now I get it. While I'm putting the pieces together, I don't get it. I know what it's supposed to look like. Because the apostles, they've got all the prophecies. So they've got the puzzle top cover. They know what it's supposed to be like. They just can't get the pieces together until after the resurrection, and then there it is. Okay. Oh, Ray,
Did they
do your microphone so I record it.
Did they hand him over to Pilate so that they could continue with the Passover feast?
Well, no, they handed him over to Pilate because Pilate's the only one who had the power to execute. The reason that they didn't go in was because they didn't want to become unclean going into the Gentile surroundings like that. But no, their intent was to have him killed. Yeah. And the funny thing is that crucifixion was abhorrent to the Jews. They didn't mind stoning people, but I mean, crucifixion was just something that they couldn't stand. It went against all things that they believed about the worth of people, and that except for this crucifixion, you know, because we'll see. Well, we won't see, but on Fridays when we do the Book of Acts, we'll see that the Jews had no problems executing. They executed Stephen. That'll be in chapter 6 or 7, of Acts. But they'll execute him. They'll stone him. And we even see in Jesus's time, people, the woman caught in adultery, they were going to stone her. Jesus said, "Well, let the one without sin cast the first stone." So I don't get all the execution stuff up there. Thing about, well, they couldn't kill Jesus because they had no rights to execution. But then we see examples of it. And I don't know, it may be that that's just to make us another point, because I don't even know that Jesus had to die on a cross. You'd have to think back. I don't, that's the Roman form of execution. Psalm 22 kind of alludes to a crucifixion, where they pierced my hands and my feet. And
The pike.
what's that?
Later came the pike, they balcony the person they were killing on the pike and then disembowel them. So that may have been even worse than.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't see anything previous to that said he had to be executed that way. But I'm just confusing myself.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
was that in my mind, when you were saying that, I was thinking, well, yes, it had to be the cross because the cross became the symbol because
our deacons are wearing crosses, and if you didn't get killed on a cross, why would they be wearing those? No, yeah, no. But anyway, the point is is it had to go a certain way. But one thing in the prophecy that, or a statement that, Jesus made somewhere in one of those gospels, was that he would be handed over. And I don't know if that means that handed over from the Jews to the Romans, handed over by Judas to the Jews, but there's something,
I'll leave
yeah, I got, I'll give it to Ray. He can look it up and
call you at 4 o'clock in the morning.
that's right. Anyway, so what we've got is, he's before Pilate and he gives no answers, okay, other than you said it. You said I'm the king of the Jews. You said it. But then now he's frustrating Pilate. So we go into 15 and he says, verse 15 says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Don't know much about this thing about handing over a prisoner at the, feast. I don't think it was an every year thing, but I think it was probably to, make peace with the people. It's your high holy day. We as Rome, we're going to give you something. And usually what you would expect is that if there's somebody who was unjustly arrested or something, you want to get, it's like asking for a presidential pardon or something, and you do that. And they bring up about Barabbas, but the thing about Barabbas isn't a good guy. So I think that so it says in verse 17, it says, so when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? I think what he's thinking there is, okay, I'm going to offer up the worst guy who's just going to cause the Jews well, that'd be Jesus too, cause trouble to the Jews. Like that, but I'm going to give them the good guy or the bad guy and let them, choose. And we know the story. They're gonna choose Barabbas. But Barabbas was kind of like a Charles Manson type character. A person that everyone hates and that they know is bad. Like, now he was an insurrectionist, so he was trouble to the Romans. Which is funny because Pilate's going to talk about about what trouble are you to me type of thing, and here he's willing to release a guy who is an actual insurrectionist trying to overthrow the Roman government, the Roman rule.
Probably a lot of envy there too, don't you think?
Envy by who?
The people that wanted him killed.
That want Jesus
They
killed?
wanted Jesus killed. They were envious of his status amongst the people,
Well, yeah.
I think.
Yeah, no. I mean, they wanted him killed. Well, but he was threatening them, regardless of their status. He was threatening them. I mean, Jesus was the one who was making the people, on his side. Yeah, because what he's doing is pointing at them, at the leaders. So anyway, so Pilate thinks he's found a way out of the dilemma. I don't know, maybe he had Barabbas out on the balcony there with Jesus. Okay, by applause, I'm gonna put my hand over their head, and whoever gets the most applause, is the one that gets released. So you got the killer Barabbas and Jesus. It's funny because everybody knows Jesus wandered the countryside healing people and making things, making things right. And this is in verse 18 says, for he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. That's what Andy was just saying, which is kind of a little editorial note by Matthew there. Anyway, so he's handed over. So, Pilate has this dilemma. Remember, I'm going to work this towards how Pilate ends up in the Apostles' Creed. So, verse 19. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him. In some of the translations, it's called the Bema seat. And the Bema seat is is actually, well, in Jewish stuff, it's the judgment seat of God. It's just called the Bema. If you go into a Jewish synagogue, their altar is called the Bema. So it says, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him. So here comes a note. It says, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. So God's talking to Pilate through his wife, And so what she's saying, first of all, she's calling him a righteous man, so she knows something. We don't know exactly what she knows, how she knows it, other than in a dream. And she says that she's suffered much, which I think that means that, I had a sleepless night, I would imagine. She's tossing and turning, just can't get this, out of her mind. So that brings up a point. What do we think of dreams? Does God speak in dreams?
You could die.
Does he speak through pizza? What? I mean, late night pizza? Who said what? Oh, I think, yeah, Daniel he spoke to in dreams.
Dave-
Pardon?
David,
No, we see, it talks about visions and dreams that at least Old Testament people went through, and maybe that part's a little different. But you hear stories about all the Muslims that convert, and I don't know what to believe, but a lot of them say, that because they couldn't get preaching, they said they got it through dreams. Yeah, I mean, nothing says, not to accept dreams. Now, in Hebrews 1, it says, in bygone days, God talked through the prophets, and I don't remember if dreams were listed, but now today he speaks through his son, Jesus Christ. Joe.
Yeah, you kind of have to question a couple of things here. You know that the Jewish rulers had set this up, so I think the courtyard is probably jammed with their particular constituents. And the Christ followers were kind of forced out, so that hedging the vote, shall we say, knowing it's coming. But the other thing is that why would God send a dream to Pilate's wife to warn Pilate to not do this when God wanted it done? It seems.
I'm sorry. Because God wanted Christ on the cross, so why would he do something? Because this kind of goes.
Was this just to give Pilate a chance to redeem himself?
I think so. Well, it's to push. I think it's to push Pilate in the direction that he should go. God knows all things. He knows the beginning from the end, and he knows how it all works out. But that doesn't mean that he's not moving the chess pieces. Yeah, as it goes. So in Pilate's case, I mean, Pilate, my view, and we'll see this when we get later. My view is Pilate comes this close to doing the right thing. But that's like the baseball player that swings and misses at the ball, and he's got that great hard swing, and he just misses a home run by that much because he didn't hit the ball by that much. So let's go through it and we'll, and we'll see.
The
Oh, I'm sorry.
past question of AI, Gemini, why was Jesus crucified rather than being stoned? And it says that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, not stoned for several reasons. Crucifixion was a Roman method of execution, particularly for slaves, political rebels, and those deemed a threat to Roman authority. So that's why Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And
Yeah.
Jesus said, "It is as you said," but he also said, "My kingdom is not of this earth."
Right, we'll get to that, so. Yeah, no, I mean, he's crucified because that's the way that the Romans crucified, if the Jews had killed him, they would have stoned him,
Mhm.
so. So let's see. All right, so you got this incident with the wife. We're in Matthew 27 at the end. So now the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd to talk for Barabbas and destroy Jesus, So the chief priests and elders are working the crowd to get their plan carried out. They're pulling the strings, you know, they're like the dirty tricks people working the crowd. Now, I forget who said that they thought that, it was anti, the not for Jesus crowd that was down there. I don't know. I think all the people are confused. We don't realize how confused people are over who is this Jesus. So it could be the very people who welcomed him in, on the triumphal entry, and they're all for him. They've heard of his works, they've seen his works. He just raised Lazarus, did all this stuff, but within 7 days, they can be completely turned around just because they don't have a strong rooting. You got to remember, this is all new to them. And who do I fear more, this Jesus guy or um, the high priest and his crowd who actually have power over my family? We don't know, Ray.
Well, didn't the Sanhedrin have the power of the temple?
Who?
The Sanhedrin, didn't they have the power of the temple? You vote against me, then I'll kick you out of the temple.
No, that's what I'm saying. No, that's what I'm saying. Those people had power. We see this in churches, if not today, but it probably still is today. But you see in the history of the church, the power that the church had over the people, or people who know that even today, who know that there's something rotten in Denmark in my church. I don't know exactly what it is, but I can't leave because, and there's just the power that the church has. I mean, over your extended family, or we don't see that so much today. People hop church to church, no problem. And the church that you left doesn't even know that you're gone.
Yeah.
Andy.
We're just sitting here peacefully talking over the alternatives. This would have been a group of a lot of people raising all kinds of cane.
Yeah.
Big crowd want to come see this, the big thing happening for the day and all that. And that may came into play, or the politics of the time.
And even once a crowd starts to turn, even when a crowd starts to turn, I feel strongly. I voted for Jesus button on. Until you get in that crowd, you find out, well, wait a minute, I thought the crowd believed that too, but I guess they don't. Maybe I need to rethink and
Exactly.
yeah.
Popular demand.
Yeah. So anyway, so he says, so they talked to the crowd. In verse 21, it says, the governor again said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said Barabbas. So, it's the Romans, it's the governor, it's the Jewish crowds. It's not just the chief priests and the elders. You got a whole bunch of people now who say Barabbas. And Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? They all said, let him be crucified. So, and this is the question that people face today. We all face. what am I gonna do with Jesus? And you say that to people, they go, well, tell me, what do you think of Jesus? What would you do with Jesus if you were confronted? Hang on just a second, Ray. Most of the world doesn't say crucify him today. They don't say crucify him, but they do say keep him out of my sight, keep him out of my presence. Don't talk about Jesus. Don't wear your Jesus hat or your Jesus shirt in a crowd or to a school. Like if kids wear it to school, right?
I wanted to find out what Barabbas' first name was.
Ralph, we all know that, Ralph.
No,
Oh.
Jesus. His
What?
first name was Jesus.
Where did they get that from?
Anywhere.
No, I'm saying, you wonder. I wonder where they would get that from. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm just saying I wonder where they would get that from. I guess you'd have to look up all the mentions of Barabbas, in the concordance and find out if ever it's listed as Jesus Barabbas or,
And Barabbas means son of the Father,
yeah.
which is also Jesus,
Yeah.
the son of.
Well, all the people, I shouldn't say all the people, but all the people in Israel back in that day were kind of named for something of the promise. I mean, just because they all thought maybe in my generation, maybe in my family, and so and in fact, in Joe's children's message today, he was talking about the importance of naming people. And do we name people today for the reasons that they named in the past? Or is it just that, I don't know, what's the popular name now? Heather? I don't know. No, man, I don't know. I don't know what the popular name is, but they go by the popular, go by the popular name and with no thought to, Joe asked her. What?
We're nothing because in NICU, some of the names that these moms came up with,
Oh,
crazy.
Yeah.
Lulu, Ladasha, and Ladasha's silent.
Yeah. No. I mean, for whatever reasons that they do, but it's not for that same, type of. But Joe, who here knows what their name does mean?
Me, yeah.
Huh?
Who knows?
I do.
Mine's supposed to be. I haven't looked it up in a long time. It's supposed to be well born. Even though I did come out with my umbilical cord wrapped around my neck and I was blue, so maybe that was so born. What were you going to say? What your name is, Dennis?
Yeah, mine, the great big dictionary, Dennis, is manger.
Manger?
Manger.
Horse trough?
Huh?
Horse trough? A horse trough?
Didn't say whether it was a wheat straw or whatever. Manger. I think characteristically here in the United States, most names originate from a relative.
Yeah.
Not because it has a meaning, but because your great aunt or your grandfather. From old Germany, from old Germany.
Yeah, well, Jews do that. Jews will name, it has to be a deceased relative.
Yeah.
So you can't be John Jr. if John's your dad.
Which language are you talking about that the Jews are talking in at that time? That would have been.
Well, you would probably name for, it would be like if I was named after a relative, it would be probably a relative that my mom knew, which probably spoke the same language.
Friend, neighbor, whatever.
Pardon?
A friend, a neighbor, or whatever.
Well, it's supposed to be a relative, like that. And I don't remember the significance of that. So anyway, so they say, let's crucify him. And here's what Pilate does. Again, we're looking at these steps Pilate does. He said, why? What evil has he done? I mean, see, after all the testimony, Pilate can't see what evil he's done. What's he done? What's he done wrong? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. We'll see more of the answers when we get to the John 18 passage in a minute.
They were nondescript people then,
They were what?
nondescript people yelling for it. Had no bearing on anything except popular numbers.
Right, they have the crowd worked up. I mean, yeah, there's no
Nothing
doubt.
behind it.
So in verse 24, so when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water, washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Okay? And then anything that happens after that is why Pontius Pilate's in the creed. I mean, he had a chance to stand up, say, no, I'm the governor. One phone call, and I can have half of the Roman army in town, protecting this guy, punishing you and protecting him. That's what he could have done. Now, that wasn't God's plan, but that was the test. I say this without any knowledge of it, like most things. I mean, that was his test. He could have at least gone down as the one trying to protect Jesus, and he didn't. And all the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children.
An indictment.
Huh? What an indictment on themselves. Now,
Isn't that proven true though?
Pardon?
Since, isn't that proven true? That the Jews
Well,
persecuted so many years.
there's two ways to look at it. Do the Jews go through all the problems they go through today because they said, well, his blood is on our hands and this is just a consequence of that? Or is that just wicked Christians reading into that and saying, we'll be God's punishers?
Could be,
Pardon?
could be.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I mean, it's the same thing with, when when Luther wrote his paper on the Jews, and this pretty scathing letter about, what to do with the Jews, because Luther at the end of his life was frustrated with the Jews. He had tried to witness to them. He's not talking about the race of people. He's talking about the religion. And he said some pretty awful things, but they spoke in a polemic way. That's just the way he spoke. He made argument with strong examples, and nobody took him serious. Nobody went out and killed Jews back in Luther's day and afterwards. But Hitler pulled it out and said, look, even the church said we should kill the Jews. We should, because this is what Luther said, burn their synagogues and all of that. Well, anyway, my point isn't the Hitler part, but it's probably the way that people treat Jews based on the statement they find in the Bible, let his blood be on us. And I don't think that was necessarily the
But
intent.
you could look at this as here, Pilate's wife had already warned him. And he could be thinking about this righteous man and saying, I want nothing to do with this. So to absolve myself
Yeah.
of any responsibility or guilt in this man's death, I'm washing my hands of it in front of you, letting you
Right.
know
No.
I have nothing to do with it.
Right. But what he should have done is what he should have done was, since he says Jesus is not guilty, is you're not going to get to touch him.
Yeah.
Right now he's under the protection he's under the right. Well, yeah, but
He was caught between a rock and a hard.
no. I understand that. I mean, Pilate was in a tough place, but the right thing to do would have been to protect Jesus. But again, he couldn't be successful because we got to get Jesus on the cross. That's the whole thing. And we'll see. We're going to flip now to the John story. Okay, John 18, if you need to flip while Ray's talking.
Well, my understanding was that even Pilate had Jesus first, And maybe he thought that if I do this to him, that will satisfy him.
Right, yeah, and that's the next verses that was in there. I was gonna skip over. Then he turned him over to be scourged, to be flogged, and the thought is maybe he thought, well, if I beat him up, that'll satisfy, satisfy the Jews, but it doesn't. Let's take a couple of minutes here and go through John 18:28 through 40. And it starts out the same way. And then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So they didn't mind doing the dirty deeds. They just didn't want to go in the governor's place there and be defiled and couldn't take the Passover. So, Pilate, his residence was up in Caesarea up north, but he would come to Jerusalem for the high holidays, just probably to show support, and also make sure there was no trouble. He called it wrong this time. So Pilate went outside, verse 29. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And so they answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." In fact, what they're saying is, just trust us. If this guy wasn't an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him to you. We wouldn't have wasted your time. Oh, yeah. They answered him, let's see. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So they've already made up their mind that he needs to be put to death. When Pilate says, "Well, you take him and you judge him." Well, we've already done that, and we've already come to the conclusion that we can't carry it out the way that
That's a hypocrisy on their behalf again. Because they didn't hesitate to stone Stephen, they didn't go ask Pilate.
Yeah, I'd have to look and see, because now Stephen's stoning would come, let's see, so Jesus gets crucified, he gets raised, he walks the earth for 40 days. We have the disciples waiting in Jerusalem for 10 days. This is the first chapter of Acts. For 10 days, that's 50 days. That takes us to Pentecost, which we'll get into in Acts chapter 2. And then you kind of have to do kind of a timeline to get to Stephen and see, I don't know, maybe that's a year later, maybe it's only 3 months later, and all of a sudden the Jews are stoning people. So yeah, that's what's.
See, they tried to stone Jesus before that, when
Yeah.
he read in the synagogue, and they said, "Today this prophecy is fulfilled."
Yeah.
They took him outside and they wanted to stone him.
Yeah.
Of course,
No, that's the confusing part, is what is that relationship with Pilate, that they've got to get him to Pilate. Maybe they knew that Jesus was extra special, just not extra special. And we probably better not call this damnation down on ourselves. I don't know, and I don't think it says, Ray.
I forgot what it was.
Good. Okay, let's move on. Anyway, they answered.
Stephen was more of a religious offense, where Jesus is considered a political offense.
No, to the Jews, he's 100% religious event. That's what Pilate doesn't understand. Go handle it yourself.
No, but they were telling Pilate in testimony that Jesus is claiming to be the king of the Jews. And that's why he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he said, "Ain't it that you say?" So yeah, they thought it was a political threat.
Well, we'll see as we go. We'll see as we go through it, like that, because I think that we see that he's hearing it and he's asking, but I don't know that because after he asked it in the Matthew passage, he still tried to hand it back to the Jews. Here, you guys go handle it.
But even saying, "What has this man done wrong?"
Yeah. Yeah, no, he knows their cases. Anyway, so Pilate says, "Take him yourselves, judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put him to death." Pilate knows their case is weak. So I'm not going to get involved. There's a guy, Gallio, came after Pilate. He was governor, and he had a similar reaction in Acts 18. It says, I'll just read it to you. It says, but when Gallio was a proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reasons to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be the judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal.
Did the right thing.
He did the right thing. That's what Pilate was trying to do. Now, this guy's in a more, probably a more Gentile area, whereas Pilate's dealing with the temple and all of that.
Right.
But it's just the idea that these things that are Jewish things have to be handled by the Jews, and Pilate didn't stick to that. So it says, this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And I think that's the being handed over part. I just can't remember right now off the top of my head if he ever talked about being crucified. You know? You'd think I'd remember something like that. But anyway, so it says in verse 33, so Pilate entered the headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Okay. So he goes back into questioning Jesus. He's doing it in private. The Jewish leaders are outside. He's going inside. Let's see. Let's see. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered and said, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? He wants to know, how do you know? Hey, I mean, maybe he's asking, did God reveal this to you? You know, or do people out there tell you? Or do you just kind of know who I am? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? This is what you'd hate to be Pilate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you'd hate to be Pilate. He's kind of like Joseph, he's stuck in the middle. I mean, and he really has no way out. It's like he's saying, your people are saying you're the king of the Jew, or you're claiming to be the king of the Jews. And then you're asking me how I know that? You were here when they, when they said it, so, and then he goes, am I a Jew? How am I supposed to know? I don't get involved in these things. The Roman Empire was very open to people having their own religions. They had no problem with people having their own religions as long as they didn't cause trouble. As long as they didn't cause trouble, you could do what what you want. And he's probably wondering, how did I get sucked into this Jewish mess? Yeah. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not not from this world. He's trying to tell him, I'm not a political leader. It's something, it's something else. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose, and this is important. Mark this verse 37. He said, for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my word. You ever wonder what that Christmas scene's all about? It's for this purpose. This is the purpose I was born. To stand before you, to have judgment pronounced against me, and to get up on that cross. My God. So remember that come Christmas time. Decorate a cross. No. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Even though he's not seeking political power, he does not deny being a king. He says. Here's the funny part, though. Jesus isn't on trial. Pilate's on trial in this conversation. Somewhere in this conversation, it switched to who's on trial. You know.
When does he figure that out?
Who?
On podium?
Pardon?
When does he figure it out?
When does who figure it out? Who?
Listens to the crowd first.
Pilate? I don't think he figures it out. Yeah, his wife told him, and nobody listens, to their
They
wives.
don't?
No, but he doesn't figure it out. That's the whole thing. I don't think Pilate ever
No.
figures.
The
Hey, I mean, look at the population of the world. How many Christians are there in the world? How many of those Christians are actually Christians? But I mean, look at all the Christians in the world versus the population of the world for all the people that have lived throughout time. How many people figured it out? The Christians. Yeah. All the other people of all the other religions or non-religions or whatever. I'm not saying they didn't try, they just didn't figure it out. And that's not the right theological word to use. I mean, the Holy Spirit didn't get through to them, or whatever it might be. I don't think that Pilate quite figured it out.
Did he have all the facts or not?
Pardon?
Did he have?
Facts aren't enough. That's where we make a mistake. Facts aren't enough. We think if we talk to an unbeliever, if I can just get them enough facts about Jesus, they'll believe. And that's not what it is. They have to have the Spirit. Pardon?
The facts he was receiving, called facts, were bad.
Who?
The facts that.
Oh, you mean that Pilate? Oh, well, no, he's got truth standing right in front of him that he does. In fact, we're going to get right. We're going to get right to that. Because Jesus then, so Jesus, Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and I've come into this world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And what is Pilate's answer? It's famous saying, "What is truth?" And I don't think Pilate is trying to start up a philosophical discussion. He's saying, what's truth? We live in a secular world. There is no truth. So again, he's got truth standing right in front of him. And as much as he may be a sympathetic character, stuck in the middle of this, at every step, he ends up by denying what's obvious. So Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." And this is probably the same scene where he washes his hands, because he said the exact same thing. He washed his hands, said, "I find no guilt." And so this is probably the same, that same remark. "But you have a custom," and this is what we read, "you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now, Barabbas was a robber, which really means he was an insurrectionist. He was a bad guy. Pardon?
Murderer.
Yeah, murder. I mean, no, he's a bad guy, and but that's how much they hate Jesus. This isn't just he's causing us trouble. We're just better off if, he's gone. I mean, this is really a visceral kind of hate. It's a challenge to everything that they regard as their way of life, and their way of maintaining power. And then we'll get into in verse chapter 19 of First John. We're not going to do that now, but same thing where he sends them out to be, flogged. The same thing, like he's going to be punished, but he actually sent him out to be crucified. And that's what we'll get into next. Is we'll get into the preparation for the crucifixion, his death and burial. And who had a hand up? Did you, Ray? Oh, okay. Any last questions? Like I say, Pontius Pilate, I think in his heart wanted to do it the right way. He just didn't.
Get it.
He just didn't get it, huh?
Make a commitment.
Yeah, and
Where was it?
I mean, I don't think anybody would expect him to become necessarily a Christian, but at least civilly in his job as governor, do the right thing. But if he had done the right thing and Jesus didn't end up in the cross, we'd all be dead in our own sins. So yay, Pilate. No, probably can't do it that way either. It's a
Yay, Jesus.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's not a strange story, but we don't know the backstory. That's the thing, Jesus knows the backstory. So let me turn this off.